Unit 5, The Gilded Age by Juliana, Brianna, and Luke. The Gilded Age is a term coined by Samuel Clemens, also known as Mark Twain. In the late 1800s, the times looked glittery and good but hid a dark, worthless underbelly. It started the creation of the first billionaires, the connection of country by rail, an explosion of technology, as well as political corruption, shady business dealings, and a growing wave of destitute immigrants living in squalid conditions. Panic of 1873. It was due to post-war inflation, over-speculation in railroads and factories, and too easy credit given by banks. This eventually leads to the Great Railroad Strike. The Great Railroad Strike of 1877 began in response to the cutting of wages for the second time in a year by the B&O Railroad. Republicans start to lose popularity, so the North rejects Reconstruction and the South accumulates more debt. The Democrat Party popularity rises. Republican Party splits. Stalwarts versus the half-breeds. The stalwarts were led by Senator Roscoe Conkling. They were sometimes called Conklinites. They were conservative, traditional Republicans who opposed the civil service reform. Half-breeds were led by Senator James G. Blaine, a disparaging term meant to suggest that they were only half Republican. They were moderately liberal Republicans who supported the civil service reform. The Civil Service Reform. The Pendleton Civil Service Act required merit to receive government positions. This would essentially eliminate the Jacksonian spoils system tradition. Initially affected only 10% of government jobs, but stopped the worst offenses. This was passed by George H. Pendleton. This was very controversial because people who received a job from this act were protected by it, so they had no repercussions when they were unlawful. President Grover Cleveland. He was the first Democratic president since Buchanan. Because of the laissez-faire capitalism mindset, which made big businesses very happy, he bridges the North and South gap by naming two former Confederates also to his cabinet. The Grand Army of the Republic, Union war veterans who generally sided with Republicans, pushed several bills through the Congress that gave pensions to many veterans, though not always well-deserved. Most of these bills were vetoed by Cleveland. Tammany Hall. Democratic political machine held power from 1854 to 1932. He was notorious for graft, which is authority for political or personal gain. Focused on bringing Irish immigrants into their organization, helping them enter politics, and assimilating into American society. This was led by William Boss Tweed. It was significant because it allowed immigrants to vote even if it was controlled and bribed. This was a perfect example of the time frame because what seemed like a regular political hall really was a legal political machine, although many of the things they did to gain power was illegal. Ellis and Angel Island. Ellis Island allowed immigrants into the United States of America between 1892 and 1924. The Statue of Liberty is a symbol of freedom which they see when they pass to get to the United States. It has been estimated that nearly half of all Americans today can trace their lineage to Ellis Island. Ellis Island mainly brought in Irish and European immigrants. Angel Island, however, allowed immigrants into the United States of America on the West Coast, mainly from China. At its height of entrance was from 1910 to 1940 and was not anywhere near as elegant as Ellis Island. Many immigrants were held there at detention barracks and often deported because they were unfit to enter the United States. The ethnic enclave set up systems to keep old war traditions, like Catholic schools, foreign language newspapers, ethnic restaurants, theaters, and social clubs. For example, Chinatown, Little Italy, and Little Poland. Angel Island was designed to deal with the growing number of Asian immigrants, but due to racism, they were seen as suspicious and often were not allowed.
Nativism. Nativism was a policy or belief that protects the interests of the native population of a country, such as, America. Many feared the cultural differences between the Chinese and Americans, so Chinese were often regulated to menial labor. Americans were still afraid of Chinese taking their jobs. So this resulted in the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1886. This banned the immigration of Chinese, which came in large numbers and worked for little pay, undermining labor unions. Jacob Riis. He wrote the book How the Other Half Lives. It showed the terrible living conditions of East Manhattan and received very big public notice which really cleaned up the area and the building conditions of Manhattan. The Haymarket Riot. The Knights of Labor became involved in a series of May Day strikes which ultimately hurt their image. The Haymarket Square riot began as a rally in support of striking workers until an unknown person threw an explosive at the police. 8 anarchists were captured and 4 were executed. Child labor. Many different forms of child labor arose at the time. They were paid much less than regular workers. Many different forms of child labor were working in factories doing dangerous jobs that adults wouldn't regularly do, or working in houses such as servants. The newsies. This was a very predominantly big form of child labor at the time, and they were usually from ages 5 to 10. They would leave their home to lift the burden from their families of feeding them. They were paid very little and mistreated. This led to drinking, smoking, visiting whorehouses, saloons, and criminal activity at a very young age for these boys. The newspaper wars. 2 titans of the newspaper industry emerged with great wealth and success: Joseph Pulitzer and William Randolph Hearst. This led to yellow journalism, an act of stretching the truth of an event to sell more newspapers or products. The man who built America. Cornelius Vanderbilt. He was an American businessman, tycoon, and philanthropist who started a steamboat line in New York and started the New York Central Railroad. John D. Rockefeller. He was an American businessman who was the co-founder of Standard Oil Company, which dominated America's oil industry. It was the first great U.S. business trust. Andrew Carnegie. He was an American businessman who expanded the steel industry greatly. He wrote The Gospel of Wealth, which told the rich to use their wealth to give back to society. J.P. Morgan. He was an American banker who excelled in corporate finance at the time. Captains of industry used their wealth to create jobs, increase productivity, and expand the market. Robber barons, on the other hand, built their fortunes from exploiting workers and engaged in illegal business practices to increase their wealth no matter what. The growth of cities. Aided by rapid economic growth, immigrants were attracted to higher wages for labor workers. Major migration centered around cities due to factory jobs. Even though this was a prosperous time for the U.S., the population was very poor. Socially, schools and hospitals were developing, as well as intolerance for child labor.
The uneven distribution of income. Throughout the vicious expansions of industries, the top dogs gained all the glory. The most money was being made in American history during these decades. Even with the middle class, the gap was very significant. Labor workers worked for little to nothing, while a company was making more than ever. Corruption and greed ran the social dynamics. Yet, in America, the pay and conditions were still better than European workplaces, which is why so many immigrants were willing to venture. Monopolies and trusts. Monopoly is when a single company achieves control over an entire market. The company that is in charge of the monopoly owns all the parts that run the operation. The significance is that it allows for consistency in products, but prices go up with no other choice of product elsewhere. Other companies assign trusts to a person to manage, creating corporate wealth while killing off competitors. Captains of industry positively impact USA, creating jobs, but robber barons exploited their workers. Money was most important to them, and they did illegal activities. The Gibson girl was a statuesque, ideal feminine figure with a stylish ease, became the fashion and goal of the average American female. She was always focused in appropriate attire, working or exercising. Socially, she depicted a modern woman involved in suffrage and sexual freedom while also wanting the right of equal education and work opportunities. She was the first national beauty standard. Louis Hine. He was a photographer known for his photos of the young workers in city slums during the Progressive Era. He represented the National Child Labor Committee. He documented human contribution to modern industry. His photographs, Girls in Factory and Breaker Boys and other photographs, showed how uneducated and miserable these young people were in the workplace. Both physically and emotionally, childhoods were lost, and illness and injury was a constant threat. Company towns. Company towns were towns that owned everything in them, and the people that lived there had very low income that went to their high interest rate. They sustained their own economy because they worked in the businesses that were provided by the the people that own the town.
Thanks for listening to our video.
See you in class.